Part 2 of The Little Mermaid. Only now did the little mermaid understand that the ship was in danger. She had to be careful herself and keep away from the spars and broken pieces of timber that were being flung by the waves. For a moment it grew so dark that she could see nothing. Then a bolt of lightning illuminated the sinking ship. She looked for the young prince among the terrified men on board who were trying to save themselves. But not until that very moment, when the ship finally sank, did she see him. At first she thought joyfully, "Now he will come down to me." But then she remembered the man could not live in the sea, and that the young prince would be dead when he came to her father's castle. "He must not die," she thought, and dived in among the wreckage, forgetting the danger that she herself was in. For if any of the great beams that were floating in the turbulent sea could have crushed her, she found him. He was so tired to swim any farther, he had no more strength in his arms and legs to fight the storm whipped wave. He closed his eyes, waiting for death, and he would have drowned had the little mermaid not saved him. She held his head above the water and let the waves carry them where they would. By morning the storm was over. Of the wrecked ship not a splinter was to be found. The sun rose glowing red, and its rays gave color to the young prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The light, the little mermaid kissed his forehead and stroked his wet hair. She thought that he looked like a statue in her garden. She kissed him again and wished passionately that he would live. In the far distance she saw land. The mountains rose blue in the morning air. The snow was on their peaks, was glistening white as a swan's feather. All the shore there was a green forest, and in its midst lay a cloister or a church. The little mermaid did not know which. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and by the entrance gate stood a tall palm tree. There was a little bay near by where the water was calm and deep. The mermaid swam with her prince toward the beach. She laid him in the fine white sand, taking care to place his head in the warm sunshine, far from the water. In the big white building, bells were ringing and a group of young girls were coming out to walk in the garden. The little mermaid swam out to some rocks and hid behind them. She covered her head with seaweed so that she could not be seen, and then peeped toward land to see who would find the poor prince. Soon one of the young girls, discovered him. At first she seemed frightened, and she called to the others. A lot of people came. The prince opened his eyes and smiled up at those who stood around him, not out at the sea where the little mermaid was hiding. But then he could not possibly have known that she was there, and that it was she who had saved him. The little mermaid felt so terribly sad. The prince was carried into a big white building, and the little mermaid dived sorrowfully down into the sea and swam home to her father's castle. She had always been quiet and thoughtful. Now she grew even more silent. Her sisters asked her what she had seen on her first visit up above, but she did not answer. Many mornings and evenings she would swim back to the place where she had last seen the prince. She watched the fruits in the orchard ripen and be picked, and she saw the snow on the high mountains melt, but she never saw the prince. She would return from each of her visits a little sadder. She would seek the comfort by embracing the statue in her garden, which looked like the prince. She no longer tended her flowers, and they grew into a wilderness, covering the paths and weaving their long stalks and leaves into branches of the trees. And that is so that it became quite dark down in her garden. At last she could bear her sorrow no longer, and told one of her sisters about it. And almost at once the others knew as well. But no one else was told, that is, except for a couple of other mermaids. but they didn't tell it to anyone except their nearest and dearest friends. It was one of these friends who knew who the prince was. She too had seen the birthday party on the ship, and she could tell where he came from and where his kingdom was. Come, little sister, the other princess called, and with their arms around each other's shoulders, they swam. All in a row, they rose to the surface. When they came to the shore where the prince's castle stood, it was built of glazed yellow stones. It had many flights of marble stairs leading up to it. The steps of one of them went all the way down to the sea. Golden domes rose from the roofs, and pillars bore an arcade that went all the way around the palace. Between the pillars stood marble statues. They looked almost as if they were alive. Through the clear glass of the tall windows, one could look into the most beautiful chambers and halls, where silken curtains and tapestries hung on the walls, and there was a large painting that were a real pleasure to look at. In the largest hall was a fountain. The water shot high up toward the glass in the roof, through which the sunbeams fell on the water and the beautiful flowers that grew in the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where the prince lived, the little mermaid spent many an evening and nights looking out at the splendid palace. She swam nearer to the land than any of her sisters had ever dared. There was a marble balcony that cast its shadow across a narrow canal, and beneath it she hid and watched the young prince, who thought that he was all alone in the moonlight. Many an evening she saw the princess sail with his musicians in his beautiful boat. She peeped from behind the tall reeds, and if someone noticed her silver white veil, they probably thought that she was only a swan stretching its wings. Many a night she heard the fishermen talking to each other and telling about how kind and good the prince was, and she was so glad that she had saved his life when she had found him, half dead, drifting on the waves. She remembered how his head had rested on her chest, and with what passion she had kissed him. But he knew nothing about his rescue. He could not even dream about her. More and more she grew to love human beings, and wished that she could leave the sea and live among them. It seemed to her that their world was far larger than hers. On ships they could sail across the oceans, and they could climb the mountains high above the clouds. Their country seemed even ever so large, covered with fields and forests. She knew that they stretched much farther than she could see. There was so much that she wanted to know. There were so many questions that her sisters could not answer. Therefore, she asked her old grandmother, since she knew much about the higher world, as she called the lands above the sea. If men are so unlucky as to drown, asked the little mermaid, then do they live forever? Don't they die as we do down here in the sea? Yes, they do, answered her grandmother. Men must also die, and their lifespan is shorter than ours. We can live until we are 300 years old, but when we die, we become the foam on the ocean. We cannot even bury our loved ones. We do not have immortal souls. When we die, we shall never rise again. We are like the green reeds. Once they are cut, they will never be green again. But men have souls that live eternally even after their bodies have become dust. They rise high up into the clear sky where the stars are. As we rise up through the water to look at the world of man, they rise up to the unknown, the beautiful world that we shall never see. Why do I not have an immortal soul? Sighed the little mermaid unhappily. I would give all my 300 years of life for only one day as a human being, if afterward I should be allowed to live in the heavenly world. You shouldn't think about things like that, said her old grandmother. We live far happier down here than man does up there. I am going to die, become foam of the ocean, and never again hear the music of the waves or see the flowers and the burning red sun. Can I do nothing to win an immortal soul? No, said the old mere woman. Only if a man should fall so in love with you that you were dearer to him than his mother and father, and he cared so much for you that all his thoughts were of his love for you, and he let a priest take his right hand and put it in yours, while he promised to be eternally true to you, then his soul would flow into your body, and you would be able to partake of human happiness. He can give you a soul and keep his own, but it will never happen. For that which we consider beautiful down here in the ocean, your fishtail, they find ugly up above on earth. They have no sense up there. You have to have two clumsy props, which they call legs, in order to be called beautiful. The little mermaid sighed and glanced sadly down at her fishtail. Let us be happy, said her old grandmother. We can swim and jump through the waves for 300 years. That is time enough. Tonight we are going to give a court ball in the castle. Such a splendor did not exist up above on earth. The walls, the ceilings of the great hall were made of clear glass. 400 giant green and pink oyster shells stood in rows among the walls. Blue flames rose from them and not only lighted the hall, but also illuminated the sea outside. Numberless fishes, both big and small, swam close to the glass walls. Some of them had purple scales, others seemed to be of silver and gold. Through the great hall flowed a swiftly moving current, and on that the mermen and the mermaids danced, while they sang their own beautiful songs. Such lovely voices are never heard upon the earth, and the little mermaid sang the most beautifully of them all. The others clapped their hands, and when she had finished, and for a moment she felt happy, knowing that she had the most beautiful voice both on earth and in the sea. But soon she started thinking again of the world above. She could not forget the handsome prince and mourn because she did not have an immortal soul like his. She sneaked out of her father's palace, away from the ball, from the gaiety down into her little garden. From afar the sound of music, of horns being played, came down to her through the water, and she thought, now he is sailing up there, the prince whom I love more than I love my father and mother, he who is ever in my thoughts, and in whose hands I would gladly place all my hope and happiness. I would dare to do anything to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing in the palace, I will go to the sea witch, though I have always feared her, and ask her to help me. The little mermaid swam toward the turbulent maelstrom. Beyond, in the sea witch lived, in this part of the great ocean where the little mermaid had never been before. Here no flowers or seaweed grew, only the gray naked sea bed stretched toward the center of the maelstrom, the great whirlpool where the water, as if it had been set in motion by a gigantic mill wheels, twisted and turned, grinding, tearing, and sucking anything that came within its reach down into its depths. Through this turbulence the little mermaid had to swim, for beyond it lay the bubbling mud flats that the sea witch called her bog, and that had to be crossed to come to the palace where she lived. The sea witch's house was in the midst of the strangest forest. The bushes and trees were gigantic polyps that were half plants and half animals. They looked like snakes with hundreds of heads, but they grew out of the ground. Their branches were long, slimy arms, and they had fingers as supple as worms. Every limb was in constant motion from the root to their utmost point. Everything they could reach they grabbed and never let go of it again. With dread, the little mermaid stood at the entrance to the forest. Her heart was beating with fear. She almost turned back. But then she remembered her prince and the soul she wanted to gain, and her courage returned. She braided her long hair and bound it around her head, so the polyps could not catch her by it. She heard her arms. She held her arms folded tightly across her breast, and then she flew through the water as fast as the swiftest fish. The ugly polyps stretched out their arms, and their fingers tried to grasp her. She noticed that every one of them was holding as tightly as iron bands onto something that it had caught. Drowned human beings peeped out, white skeletons among the polyps' arms. There were sea chests, rudders of ships, skeletons of land animals, and then she saw a poor little mermaid who had been caught and strangled, and this sight was to her the most horrible. At last she came to a great slimy open place in the middle of the forest. Big fat eels played in the mud, showing their ugly yellow stomachs. Here the witch had built her house out of the bones of drowned sailors, and there she sat, letting a big ugly toad eat out of her mouth, as human beings sometimes let a canary eat sugar candy out of theirs. The ugly eels she called her little chickens had held them close to her spongy chest. I know what you want, she cackled, and it is stupid of you. But you shall have your wish, for if it will bring you misery, little princess. You want to get rid of your fishtail and instead have two stumps to walk on, as human beings have, so that the prince will fall in love with you, and you will gain both him and an immortal soul. The witch laughed so loudly and evilly that the toad and the eels had she had on her lap jumped down onto the mud. You came at the right time, she said. Tomorrow I could not have helped you. You would have had to wait a year. I will mix you a potion. Drink it tomorrow morning before the sun rises, while you are sitting on the beach. Your tail will divide and shrink. You will become what human beings call pretty legs. It will hurt. It will feel as if a sword were going through your body. All who will see you will say that you are the most beautiful human child they have ever seen. You will walk more gracefully than any dancer, but every time your foot touches the ground, it will feel as you are walking on knives so sharp that your blood must flow. If you are willing to suffer all of this, I can help you. I will, whispered the little mermaid, and thought of her little prince and how she would win an immortal soul. But remember, screeched the witch, that once you have a human body, you can never become a mermaid again. Never again shall you swim through the waters with your sisters to your father's castle. If you cannot make the prince fall so much in love with you that he forgets both his mother and his father, because his every thoughts concerns only you, and he orders the priest to take his right hand and place it in yours, so that you become man and wife. Then the first morning after he marries another, your heart will break, and you will become foam in the ocean. I still want to try, said the little mermaid, and her face was white as a corpse. But you have to pay me too, grinned the witch. And I want no small payment. You have the most beautiful voice of all those who live in the ocean. I suppose you thought of using that to charm your prince. But that voice you will have to give to me. I want the most precious thing you have to pay for my potion. It contains my own blood, so that it can be as sharp as a double edged sword. But if you take my voice, said the little mermaid, what will I have left? Your beautiful body, said the witch, your graceful walk, and your lovely eyes. Speak with them, and you will be able to capture a human heart. Have you lost your courage? Stick out your little tongue and let me cut it off in payment, and you shall have the potion. Let it happen, whispered the little mermaid. The witch took out a cauldron in which to make the magic potion. Cleanliness is a virtue, she said, and before she put the pot over the fire, she scrubbed it with eels, which made she had made into a whisk. She cut her chest and let the blood drip into the vessel. The steam that rose became strange figures. The steam that rose became strange figures that were terrifying to see. Every minute the witch put something different into the cauldron. When the brew reached a boiling point, it sounded as though a crocodile were crying. At last the potion was finished. It looked as clear and as pure as water. Here it is, said the witch, and cut out the little mermaid's tongue. Now she was mute. She could neither speak nor sing. If any of the polyps should try to grab you on your way back through my forest, said the witch, you only need to spill one drop of the potion on it, and its arms and fingers will splinter into 1,000 pieces. But the little mermaid didn't have to do that. Fearfully, the polyps drew away when they saw what she was carrying in her hands, and the potion sparkled as though it were a star. Safely, she returned through the forest, the bog, and the maelstrom. She could see her father's palace. The lights were extinguished in the great hall. Everyone was asleep, and yet she did not dare seek out her sisters now that she was mute and she was away, going away from them forever. She felt as if her heart would break with sorrow. She sneaked down into the garden and picked a flower from each of her sisters' gardens. Then she threw 1,000 kisses toward the palace and swam upward to the deep blue sea.